Hello AP World History students, Mr. Lasser here with you again, and we are in part 2 of our 3-part series on China, a key concept review, focusing on time periods 3 and 4 in this video. This is the time period where we see Chinese empires reconstituted. That classical empire of the Han has fallen away in time period 2, and we will see some new empires spring up in China using both traditional sources of power that worked for past empires like the Qin and Han, and new innovations that they will continue to improve upon in this time period. So let's begin by comparing these post-classical Chinese empires. And this is where we'll spend most of our time in this video, just thinking about these. And we'll start with an empire that actually comes about slightly before this time period begins, but it is the first empire of the time period. To help you with getting notes on all of these empires, take a look at the description down below, and you'll see a link to a review packet that will help you navigate your way through all of these notes. So let's get started with the Sui Dynasty. And I'll be honest, there's not a whole lot here that you need to know about the Sui, beyond perhaps an analogy that might make a little bit of sense if you remember what happens in the classical era. So if you recall the classical era, we see a period of decentralization in China, the Warring States period, and eventually the Qing Dynasty unites China and builds a centralized government. But it was short-lived. Its single strong ruler, Qin Shi Huangdi, does not leave a capable heir, and thus it quickly falls away. But the empire that follows it, the Han Empire, rules for over 400 years in a golden age for China. Well, the same thing really happens here with the Sui Dynasty. Following centuries of decentralization in China, the Sui Dynasty reunites China together, building the empire that you see here. They are most known in this time period for first reuniting China, but second in building the Grand Canal, a massive feat, or at least beginning the process of building this Grand Canal. What the Grand Canal does is it connects northern China, where the government was based, to southern China. And this allows for improved transportation, communication, and trade between northern and southern China. That meant that food that was produced in southern China could be brought north to feed the large population. The government of China could more easily collect taxes. They could more easily establish control over southern parts of China and help consolidate their power. And this Grand Canal was key for not just the Sui Dynasty, but the dynasties that followed. However, as you see on your in your review packet, we want to think about why each of these dynasties fall. And the Sui Dynasty simply falls for poor leadership. The second emperor of the Sui out of the 3 was a tyrant, which weakened his control of the empire. And so shortly after his death, and then the third emperor's death, the Tong Empire will rise. And that brings us to our second of these post-classical empires, the Tong Dynasty. Now, this dynasty lasts for nearly 300 years in China, and it is seen as a golden age for China. We see the expansion of Chinese territory, especially along the Silk Roads, which is why this dynasty, at least on this map, has such a funny shape, because it was seeking control over the Silk Roads. In this time period, of course, that means the Silk Road reemerges, and we see trade intensifying. Of course, that's helped within China by the Grand Canal that was started by the Sui Dynasty and is finished by the Tong, but it also leads to trade further away. The Tong Dynasty, also being a relatively powerful dynasty, is able to establish tribute states in regions around China, especially places like Korea and Vietnam, they are able to extend control over these outlying regions and demand tribute as repayment. And that is where we see some of the rituals, the tribute rituals of gift giving that happen between China and its tributaries, and also the process of kowtowing when an ambassador would have to lie on the floor before addressing the emperor. For the Tang Dynasty, tribute states were more about exerting influence over surrounding regions and less about perhaps making money. In fact, some of the tributes that were given were reciprocated by the Chinese with gifts that were actually more valuable than the tribute that was brought in, which is not great for economics, you would think, but is pretty good for exerting influence and building up those relationships. Nice. Furthermore, when we think about the Tong Dynasty, we think about how it used innovations. In China, there had been forms of civil service exams in the past. The Han Dynasty experimented with its bureaucracy in using an examination system to determine who was most capable for jobs. The Tong Dynasty really formalized that process, building a civil service examination system based initially on Confucian values to bring about the best and brightest into the Tang Dynasty bureaucracy. There are other things the Tong Dynasty does in establishing control of China. For example, they establish a new taxation system, which is called the equal field system, in addition to what they had already been doing, as we see with establishing tribute states and trade and the like. We also see in the Tong Dynasty an interesting change begin to occur, and that is that this empire of China, which had long been focused on Confucianism and had been influenced by Taoism, begins to be more and more influenced by Buddhism. And this is seen definitely with two people specifically. The first is a man named Yuan Zhang, who travels to India in the year 629, and he's going to be gone for quite some time. But when he comes back, he brings back just crates and crates of Buddhist texts from India, which he spends the rest of his life translating into Chinese, and these texts become extremely influential in China. So much so that under Empress Wu, who you see pictured here, the only female emperor of China, by the way, Buddhism is elevated to an honored position above that of Taoism in China, showing the absolute influence of Buddhism, which had been growing in China ever since the fall of the Han Dynasty. It had already been present in China during that time, but in that period of decentralization, it grew in massive popularity. Buddhist temples dotted the Chinese countryside. They owned massive amounts of land, and they even served important functions in terms of providing for the peasant communities of China, serving kind of pseudo-banking purposes. And the growth of Buddhism really comes to define the early part of the Tong Dynasty. However, that does not last. After Empress Wu passes, later on, an emperor named Wu Zong, a male emperor later on, pushes back against Buddhism. In fact, there were many people in the Chinese bureaucracy, especially those who preferred Confucianism, a religion that was, or a philosophy that developed in China. They preferred that to Buddhism, a religion that developed outside of China, and they saw it as a threat. Among other reasons, that was because Buddhist temples were and Buddhist monasteries were exempt from paying taxes to the Chinese government, and they controlled a great deal of land. Oftentimes, hoping to gain favor, people would leave their land to the monasteries rather than leaving it to someone who could then be taxed. Also, people who entered Buddhist monasteries were exempt from military service. And so this foreign religion was seen by some to be threatening to the Chinese way of life. And so a backlash begins against this foreign religion. Sometimes it's referred to as the great anti-Buddhist persecution, where Buddhist temples are destroyed across China, and some are completely done away with, although some were protected and did survive. So we see kind of this rise and fall of Buddhism in the Tong Dynasty, which is definitely important. As I mentioned earlier, here you see actually a picture of Emperor Wuzong. After this backlash against Buddhism, what we see is a renewed interest in Confucianism in China. And so we see the development of NeoConfucianism, supported by people like Han Yu, that emerges in the 9th century or the 800s. And it emphasizes Confucian values, it emphasizes patriarchy, and it will heavily influence the Song and Ming dynasties of China. And so this Neo-Confucianism will then spread to places where China has an influence, places like Korea, Japan, into Southeast Asia, and will really come to define those regions as well. Now, I went too fast here. The Tong Dynasty eventually does weaken and fall. And it falls in 907 CE, and the reason being is a rebellion against the Tong Dynasty in its later days, called the Lushan Rebellion. Ultimately, it weakens the Tong, and tens of millions of people die from this war and die from starvation. The Tong end up having to pay tribute to the Uyghurs, these nomadic, this group to their north who helps put down the rebellion. But they're never going to recover, and eventually the Tong Dynasty will crumble in favor of the rise, of course, of a new dynasty. We have to think about this dynastic cycle that constantly occurs in China. And that new dynasty is the Song Empire, or Song Dynasty. And the Song can be divided into really two time periods, what's called the Northern Song period, where their capital was in the north, and then the Southern Song period, when they're faced with pressures from northern nomads and they're forced to retreat to a more southern position. They do last for a little over 300 years, and it's a period of great innovation in China, kind of proto-industrial. For example, they use coal and coke to forge better metals. It was highly urbanized and very cosmopolitan. They participated in making great art. They also had some major innovations like the paper money, which you see here, which was referred to as flying cash or flying money, which was an innovation in the state taking a role in an economy. Beyond that, we see the improvement of inventions surrounding gunpowder with hand cannons. We see the development of the picture you see here, the water clock. We see improvements on the compass, along with a host of other inventions in this time period. And so when we think about the Song Dynasty, we want to think about innovation, even though faced with nomadic groups, they begin to, they eventually will be conquered. The last thing I want to say is that connection to Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism develops, as I said, in the Tong Dynasty, but it plays a major part in the Song Empire. Patriarchy is a continuity throughout Chinese history, and one of the examples of this that we see is the practice of foot binding, where women would have their feet bound from an early age, or broken and bound to make them appear smaller. And this was something that was done primarily among women who were well off, and thus were going to be taken care of by men in their families. And so you see there an image of a shoe that would have been worn on a bound foot. The Song Dynasty, though, eventually does fall. As I mentioned, it was conquered. They were always dealing with northern nomadic groups, and they really struggled with defense against one of these in particular, and that is the Mongols. And it's the Song Dynasty in 1279 officially comes to an end when Kublai Khan, the descendant of Genghis Khan, conquers the Mongols. Now, what we see in these dynasties between the Sui Empire, the Tong, and the Song dynasties, we have to think about how did they use traditional sources of power and legitimacy? Well, of course, Confucianism is still present, and in the later Tong, it was NeoConfucianism, and same in the Song. They all use bureaucracies, which we saw used in the classical era. They use patriarchy as a source of power. And they also all claim the mandate of heaven. If you remember, that develops among the Zhao, and every dynasty thereafter claims it as a source of legitimacy. However, there are some new innovations of these reconstituted governments. For example, the use of tribute states and the tribute system. Under the early Tong Dynasty, the role of Buddhism allowed the government of China to interact with this new popular religion and gain legitimacy in that way. And lastly, new taxation systems. I mentioned earlier the equal field system of the Tong Empire. So all of these innovations come about as a way to exert control over large areas, and they are innovations of time period 3. So again, what we're seeing are taking all the good things that the classical empires did and improving upon them. And within this time period, of course, the Tong improved upon the Sui and so forth. Now, the next two dynasties that we see in time period 4, because yes, there are a lot of dynasties in time periods 3 and 4. The next one is the Yuan Dynasty, or the Yuan Empire. And it's in time period 3, from 1279 to 1368. It was established by Kublai Khan, who conquered the Song Dynasty, as I said, in 1279. And this is the first time that we see foreign rulers over China. So we got to imagine a minority foreign group of Mongols ruling over the ethnic Han Chinese. And in fact, early on, the Chinese were largely excluded from their government. This was a period of intense Silk Road trade under the Pax Mongolica. You've got to remember, you have all these khanates basically connecting the Mediterranean all the way to China and the Pacific. There was a transfer of knowledge, which continued in this time period, and especially under the Mongols. Transfer of mathematics, astronomy, geography, printing, gunpowder. Transfer of foods like pepper and cinnamon and tea. All of these things are taking place under the Yuan Dynasty. We also see under the Yuan Dynasty some social changes, right? For example, kind of turning the Confucian hierarchy on its head, elevating merchants to a higher level, and demoting peasants to a lower level. And this makes sense. Got to keep in mind, under the Yuan Dynasty, they are controlled by the Mongols. And the Mongols were traders. They were not farmers. And so that makes sense why you might see that hierarchy change. When the Mongols go away, it gets flipped back the way it was before. Initially, there was, if we think about the relationship between these foreign rulers and the Chinese themselves, initially there was tolerance and prosperity in the Yuan Empire, but they do dismantle some aspects of what had happened in China before. For example, they dismantled the civil service system, and I mentioned already that for the most part, the ethnic Chinese were largely excluded from government in the Yuan Empire. Eventually, though, like other empires of China, the Yuan Empire, after less than 100 years, begins to weaken, and it's ultimately overthrown by a rebellion called the Red Turban Rebellion. And as a result of that, the Ming Dynasty comes to power. And the Ming Dynasty represented a return to Chinese rule. They bring back NeoConfucianism. They rolled back Mongol changes like social hierarchy. And it was a period of stability and trade, a period of art and literature, like the Ming porcelain that you see here, but literature such as Journey to the West, which was one of the earliest novels. The Ming Dynasty also reinstates civil service exams. They restore and expand the Great Wall of China, of course, because they are still dealing with Mongols to the north, even though they've kicked them out of their country. So all of these things are taking place under the Ming. Basically, you have China ruled by the Chinese again, restoring those Chinese values of the past. While moving forward. One thing that we do see under the Ming Dynasty, which is rather new, is cross-cultural exchange through maritime trade. The Ming Dynasty undertake massive send out massive treasure fleets in this time period to establish tribute states, not just in the immediate area like the Tong Dynasty had done or along the Silk Roads, but within throughout Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean. And the leader of this is a man that you may have heard of, Zheng He, who you see pictured here. And he goes out in his treasure fleets, making connections with Chinese diasporic trading communities throughout Southeast Asia, who many of them fled China to establish trade when the Mongols came in. But he seeks tribute from Southeast Asia and starts and travels, as you can see, all around Southeast Asia to India and as far away as Arabia and the East African coast. He even brings back a giraffe for the emperor. And this is all during the reign of a Chinese leader who was looking outward named Yung Law. But later on, after the emperor passed away, there are a lot of people in the Chinese bureaucracy who feel that this outward-looking Ming China is not what they need to be doing. They see that these voyages are way too costly. They believe they simply were too expensive. There was a lot of they were treated with a lot of skepticism, especially because Ming Admiral Zheng He was a Muslim eunuch, and there were a lot of Muslim eunuchs who had a say in government, and so these traditional Confucian bureaucrats didn't like that very much either. And when the emperor changes, they eventually recall Zheng He and end this practice of establishing tributaries all around Southeast Asia. And so the Ming basically pull back right around 1430 and go into what is self-imposed isolation, which is very interesting because less than 100 years later, the Europeans arrive in the Indian Ocean in the 1500s. The Portuguese first, and then later the Spanish and the British and the French and the Dutch. And that is going to have a massive change for China. The Ming Dynasty itself is going to trade with Europeans who arrive. They have no real interest in the European goods, but they are very much interested in what Europeans are using to pay for Chinese silk and porcelain, and that is silver, which is the preferred currency in China throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties. The Ming Dynasty eventually does weaken in the 1640s. There is a peasant revolt led by a guy named Li Zicheng that brings down the Ming. It is one of the bloodiest wars in history. And in order to defeat this rebellion, the Ming Dynasty goes to an outside group in Manchuria, the Manchu, and they ask them for help in putting down this rebellion. And the Manchu oblige. They simply put are perfectly fine helping them put down the rebellion, but they also realize that now the door is open to take over China. And that is exactly what the Qing Dynasty does, or what the Manchu do, and they establish the Qing Dynasty. Now, if we think about what we've looked at so far, before we consider the Qing Dynasty itself, we're seeing a lot of examples of cross-cultural exchange. Under the Tong Dynasty, we saw that they traded along the Silk Roads, and at the Battle of Talas in the year 751, they come into contact with the Abbasids, and there is a transfer of paper, of knowledge of making paper, a transfer of math and science, administrative techniques, and gunpowder. Under the Mongols, the Silk Road trade leads to massive transfers of technology, of culture, but also of diseases as well. The Black Death eventually spreads along across the Silk Roads in the era of the Mongols all the way to Europe. And lastly, we see those tributary connections under Ming Admiral Zheng He. Luxury goods, gifts exchanged, and as I said, also a giraffe, which doesn't really live that long in the menagerie of the emperor. The last thing are continuities. We still are seeing, across period 3, all of these empires, are transferring technology and culture, as you see here, but they are also dealing with peasant revolts at periods of time when there is difficulty in growing food, especially. We also see they all use patriarchy across this time period. They are all engaged in trade in one form or another to strengthen their empires. I'm interested to see in what other continuities you can come up with beyond the 3 that I have listed here. And that brings us, the Ming Dynasty actually kind of brought us into period 4, but that brings us to our last dynasty to introduce here, and we'll be dealing with them a little bit more in our next video as well, and that is the Ching Dynasty, which rules China from 1644, right at the end of period 4, all the way until 1911. This is the last of the imperial dynasties of China. The Ching Dynasty, or the Manchu, as they're also known, ousted Li Zicheng at the end of the Ming Dynasty, and they usher in that era of foreign rule. They are certainly less tolerant than the Mongols were in China. The Mongols allowed most of the ethnic Han Chinese to go about their business, but without much opportunity in government. But the Qing are much more interested in enforcing their culture on the Chinese. For example, they require all Chinese men to wear Manchu-style hair with a long braid. They also ban intermarriage between the Manchu and ethnic Han Chinese, and they also prevent them from achieving high levels in the government. The Manchu, of course, are going to be this new elite of the Manchu. They will be occupying those high positions in government. However, the Qing Dynasty does keep some things. One is the bureaucracy, which you probably could tell based on how I was talking about them, but also the civil service exams. They keep those around. They are also known in this time period for expanding China into places like Tibet and Taiwan and into Central Asia. And just like the Ming, the Qing Dynasty will continue to interact with the European presence in East Asia in this new era of global trade. More on that in the video in the videos on key concepts from Unit 4 if you'd like more information on that. So they are delighted to trade things like silk, porcelain, and tea with Europeans in exchange for, of course, silver. But they will later attempt, as we'll see in our next video, to reduce European influence in China. And that self-imposed isolation and rejection of a lot of what Europeans have to offer will actually be the thing that will doom the Qing Dynasty and China in our next time period. So that brings us to an end of this part 2 video on China, thinking about time periods 3 and 4. I know it went pretty quickly, so rewind it back if you need a little bit more, or take a look at some of the other key concept videos on time periods 3 and 4 for more in-depth information. I'll see you in part 3 when we look at China across periods 5 and 6.